Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My special guest today is literary legend Margaret Atwood. I can't believe you're here, Margaret.
Here I am.
Absolutely. One of your most enduring books, a particular favorite with students, is The Handmaid's Tale. In what way has this novel been pivotal in your evolution as a writer?
Oh, well, that's a pretty hard question.
I know.
What people usually ask me is what motivated me to write it. But to answer the question you actually just asked, it's my first speculative fiction. A form that I had always wanted to write in because I read a lot of them as a young person. So I wrote that one, and I've since written two others of a somewhat different nature. Those would be Oryx and Crake and The Year of the Flood. So I think it opened up a different kind of fiction for me.
This book ends with an epilogue. Did you write the story with the epilogue in mind, or did the story itself lead you to that ending?
Well, with a book like that, with a central character who doesn't have access to information because she's not allowed to read, and television has been taken over, so we, the readers, don't know how the repressive regime came into being, and our central character can't find out. So the afterword serves two purposes. Number one, it tells us, the readers, how the regime came into being, but it also tells us that that regime is now over. It's finished, because we jump ahead to the future, and in that future, the story that we've just been through is an object of study. Or you might say, repressive regimes don't die, they become thesis topics. So those are the purposes it serves. So yes, I always had it in mind, and it is something you have to think about when you're writing imaginary futures. We want to know how things got that way. And there either has to be somebody in the story who tells our narrator how they got that way, or there has to be a book or a manuscript, or there has to be an afterword.
Well, it's beautifully done, beautifully constructed. You mentioned it was speculative fiction. Some people refer to it as science fiction. Help us with that distinction.
Okay, I'm going to help you with that distinction. Think of a big heading all across the top, and it says Wonder Tales. And under Wonder Tales, we can have Grimm's Fairy Tales, we can have Alice in Wonderland, we can have Harry Potter, we can have Sword and Sorcery under Wonder Tales too. We can have Ursula K. Le Guin's The Earthsea Trilogy, of which I'm particularly fond. We can have vampire and werewolf stories, which have now become categories of their own. We can have speculative fiction, which to me means stories about things that haven't happened yet but could. That is, we have the tools for them, we have the know-how, we may even have started down that road. And then we have what I think of as science fiction proper, which is The Time Machine, War of the Worlds, and things that take place on Planet X where we have never been. Or say The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Things come in from outer space, which to our knowledge, or to the knowledge of most of us, hasn't happened. So that to me is science fiction. Now other people say, well, it's basically all science fiction. But I find it useful to make a distinction between things that we could possibly do, so that maybe we'll think better of it and not do them. And sheer adventure, fantasy, romance of the sci-fi kind, which involves, actually, I don't know about you, but I don't think the Martians have come to Earth yet in large tin cans, yet.
Well, maybe. I'm not quite ready to go
Well,
there.
they haven't come out with straws and sucked our blood the way they do in War of the Worlds. And they're unlikely to, because now we know about Mars.
Well,
You
exactly.
know, no tin can Martians on it.
In fact, you're actually writing a book now, In Other Worlds, that addresses this subject.
Yes. In fact, I have written it, and it will come out in the fall, and it's called In Other Worlds, SF and the Human Imagination. Because one of the things about Planet X is that it's where a lot of images and events that used to happen in religious narratives, but that we're no longer necessarily going to accept as part of a realistic narrative. They've gone to Planet X. So vegetation that speaks to you, unlikely on this earth unless you've been on drugs or having a nightmare. But on Planet X, it happens a lot.
Now, this may be too much of a stretch, but what about Alias Grace? It goes back in time. It's not futuristic, but it's speculative fiction in a way.
Well, you're speculating about a real murder. There was a real double murder. And as in so many murders in which a man and a woman are both involved, people have unmixed feelings about the man. He done it. But they always split on the subject of the woman. Either she was the egger on, you know, she made him do it, or she was the victim who got sucked in. And that's what happened with Grace Marks in the middle of the 19th century. She had her supporters, she had her detractors, and nobody ever actually really knew what happened, because there were 4 people involved. 2 of them ended up dead in the cellar. She and the man ran away to the United States, but they got caught. Her story, he made me do it. His story, she made me do it. And then he got hanged. She got a reprieve. So the only person left alive who knew was Grace, and she never told.
What intrigued you most about Grace?
That very gap between what we were able to read in the media of the time, what people said about her. Even the accounts of the crime scene varied. Even the accounts of what she looked like varied. They got the color. She had 3 different colors of hair. She had several different eye colors. She was a couple of different heights. They all said she was good looking, but they were quite variable on the details. That's very interesting to me, because it means that you have somebody upon whom people are projecting their inner dramas.
Oh, exactly. Was it haunting writing in her voice?
It was very, very interesting writing in her voice, because it had to be a character who knew more than she was telling anybody. And the reader has to know that she knows more than she's telling, but we don't know what that more is.
In your mind, do you feel that you know what really happened?
No.
You still don't. So it's still speculative.
It's open-ended in that she never told. She told 3 different versions of the death of Nancy Montgomery, killed by this man called McDermott. The first version was, I was worried when she didn't come home to supper. I had no idea where she was. In other words, search me. I know nothing. The second one was, the first one was, I know nothing. The second one was, I was worried when she didn't come home for dinner. And the third one was, I saw him dragging her by her hair to the trap door to the cellar. Now that's a pretty big, it's a pretty big leap from I know nothing to hair dragging.
Exactly.
Isn't it?
Exactly.
It makes you wonder whether there was a 4th version in which she was involved in the actual murder, which the McDermott person said she was. He said it. He was a known liar, but known liars don't always lie.
No. That's what makes them so endearing and fascinating. You know, even as I ask you these questions, Margaret, I'm reminded of what you say in your book on writing and negotiating with the dead, that you can never actually meet the writer of the book you just read.
No.
And I wonder, why is that the case?
Because there's always a time gap. So the person writing the book, for instance, Alias Grace, that takes us back at least, now I'm counting, what, 15 years? So 15 years ago, I was a different person. But also, when the writer is writing, they are not having a kindly conversation with you on a television talk show. So when they're immersed in the book, they actually aren't anybody you can have that conversation with. First of all, they haven't finished the book, so they're in the middle of it. So there's just a big gap between what you see today and what happened when that book was being written.
Who are some of the writers who've influenced you most?
Beginning when?
Let's say recent years.
No, that's no fun.
That's no fun. Okay,
No,
let's go back
it's much funner to go back. Beatrix Potter, the mistress of the indirect narrative.
Good point. You mentioned, you reveal in your book, Negotiating with the Dead, that you actually read Peyton Place, but you don't recommend it.
Well, I don't know whether to recommend it or not. This was when we were, of course, high school kids, and there were several different categories of books. The ones we studied in school, which were pretty 19th century, I think possibly because there was no sex on the page. It was all off stage. So that kind that we studied in school. Then there were ones that we were openly permitted to have at home. And then there were the other ones that I, for one, usually got hold of when I was babysitting. You know, other people's houses had those books in them. So you would class with it. Peyton Place was a big shocker. Something called Forever Amber.
Oh, yes.
Remember it?
Yes, I do.
The Amboy Dukes.
I haven't
Another
read
one,
that one.
Yes, another one of the Blackboard Jungle. These were all sort of, we thought we were reading about what real life was really like.
Isn't it fun to grow up and look back at all
I'm glad
that?
It's actually not like that.
No.
Not all of it. Some
No.
of it is, but I'm glad it's not every day. Peyton Place. I mean, there is so much.
Although I was hooked to the television series. I don't know if you got that in Canada or not.
Well, my parents refused to buy a television set.
So you missed
and
all of that.
They never bought one. Well, I snuck in some of it through other people's TVs, but it was not possible for me to watch a series of any kind.
It's very interesting. Do you think that contributed to your being a writer, the fact that you didn't have TV in your life?
Well, I think it goes back much earlier than that I grew up in the north, and I don't mean a town in the north, I mean right in the woods. So no television, no movies, no corner store, no library, no theater, no other people, and no electricity, and no running water. So essentially there were, however, lots of books of different kinds. And so you could read all of the books, and then when you'd read those ones, you read them all again because you couldn't go and get more. So reading, writing, and drawing were things that you could do without electricity. Those were the things that I did.
It's fascinating. How would you characterize the writing of your compatriot Alice Munro?
Oh, well, Alice is quite wonderful. She had a different kind of upbringing in that she grew up in small towns in southern Ontario. So she had a given set of characters, if you like. She had a lot of ability to observe people around her and follow plots. I taught a course called Southern Ontario Gothic, and I taught it in two places. I taught it in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and I taught it in New York City. And in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, they understood all of this completely. And in New York City, they said, is everybody in Canada, you know, crazy or mentally deranged in some way? I said, look out the window. I said, those people are here too, but you're not related to them. You know, you don't know them intimately, whereas if you're in a small town, you know everybody in the town, and therefore you know the stories of all of those people. So it's not that the people are different. It's that in a small town you know them.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely, I agree with you. I'm from a small town. Alice is known for her short story collections that revolve around the same cast of characters. You use that technique in your collection, Moral Disorder. What are the advantages and disadvantages of that kind of a format?
I think that kind of a format is like a photograph album, in which you have a snapshot of the person at 9, and then you might have, I'm thinking of the old kinds of photograph albums in which people were quite picky about how many photographs they took because they were expensive and you needed to develop them, and you glued them into the album and then you wrote things underneath them. So you see the person at important moments of their life, or family snapshots, and then you skip ahead in time. So an arrangement of stories like that is able to follow characters but not necessarily have to fill in the in-between bits. So there isn't a continuous unbroken timeline. There are snapshots, different parts of the person's life.
Your publisher emphasizes that Moral Disorder is fiction, but then adds, and this is tantalizing, that it does give us a close glimpse.
They just love those tantalizing.
Yeah, it does give us a close glimpse into your own life. How close?
Oh, I would say fairly close. In other words, I didn't put in anything that didn't happen. I didn't put in everything that did happen, but I didn't put in anything that did not happen.
Would you agree with Grace Paley, who says any story told twice is fiction?
Yes.
Isn't that a great line?
I would probably say any story told once is fiction. And if you've ever been to a trial, even just of a car crash, and there's 2 witnesses, you know that the stories are going to be somewhat different, and they were there. And it is like the Grace Mark story, to get back to that. 2 people wrote about going into the house in which the murders had been committed. One of them said nothing was out of place, we did not see that there was anything wrong. And the other one, who was there at the same time, said the house was in disarray.
Exactly. No, you're right. You're absolutely right on that. Your novel, The Blind Assassin, and I've got to admit, this is my favorite of all your books because of the complexity of it, but it brilliantly demonstrates how personal history informs fiction. How closely did you identify with the narrator in that story, Iris?
Well, what I set out to do was to write a novel that covered the years of my mother's and grandmother's lives. In other words, most of the 20th century. But I couldn't put them into it because they were too nice to be in a book by me as characters. So I have a woman of a certain age who's lived through this time. And I don't know whether I identified, I think I identified with her in a lot of ways, but she's of a generation older than mine, in fact, quite a bit older than mine. So I did hear a certain number of people saying, how did you know all this stuff? And I said, well, you listen to people talk. You know, you listen to the stories that they tell. And you also listen to them talking about what it's like to be at that age.
Do you recall when you first came up with the wonderful metaphor of the blind assassin?
The moment when I did it. I don't recall the exact moment, but a lot of these motifs are very old. And the story about the children going blind from carpet weaving, I actually read in the National Geographic, because they do use very small children to make certain kinds of carpets, or they did. The assassin motif, if you go back and research the word assassin, there was a cult of assassins, very well known in medieval times in the Middle East. And they would train people to be assassins, and then they would go into what we would now call deep cover. and they would be placed in the households of important people. And when the moment came, they would do their assassinating. So it all comes out of, you know, deep background reading. The town, which is known by the name of the heap of rubble, it's actually in the Bible. And there are a number of little odd stories in the Bible if you read it. If you read all of the words, there are a number of pretty suggestive odd stories in there that, taken out of context, you would think, you know, this could be in the Arabian Nights. They're almost folkloric.
Well, you have a story within a novel within a book.
That was tricky.
Oh, it was. I was going to say, did you think at some point, why did I make it this hard for myself?
Once it got going, it wasn't that hard, but I had to start that book 3 different times. The first time, the old lady was dead, and we were discovering her secret life through some letters in a hat box. Had to throw that out. Too many letters in hat boxes in literature already. Went back, old lady alive, 2 other people were discovering this. It had become a suitcase with a photograph album in it. I kept one of the pictures. But that wasn't working either, and I had to give her the voice. And once she had the voice, then it was fine, and the suitcase became a steamer trunk. And it's in the chapter called The Steamer Trunk.
Your latest book, we mentioned it at the top of the show, is The Year of the Flood. It's not a sequel to Oryx and Crake, but it's at least a companion book.
It's a simultaneal, by which I mean it takes place at the same time period, but in a different part of the forest. We know from reading Victorian novels that there's going to be a chapter called Meanwhile. And in Meanwhile, you read about what's been happening to these people at the same time as these other things have happened to the people that you've just read about. And you know that by the end of the book, those 2 groups of people are going to meet up. And so it is with Oryx and Crake.
What made you decide to revisit that time period?
Oh, sheer cussedness, I think, probably.
Describe the book for those who haven't had a chance to read it.
In Oryx and Crake, we're following the fortunes of a non-mathematically well-endowed young man who's growing up in a techno enclave, a privileged location inside a society which has given up on public space and has fortified the wealthier and more privileged, and the others are outside. So we follow Jimmy, who is not best equipped to be in this society, and we follow him through a global pandemic that has killed off most of the people and is in fact man-made. In fact, it's man-made by his best friend. So that's in that book. And I do say that it's a joke-filled, fun-packed adventure story about the almost total obliteration of the human race. Those ideas don't fit together necessarily for some people. In The Year of the Flood, we go outside the enclave into the public space that has been abandoned, to the slummiest of the slums, where, however, a rather brave new green religion is practicing itself on flat rooftops where they grow vegetables. And they are dedicated to rebuilding the link between mankind and the natural world and religion, which once was very strong. If you go back into any major religion or indeed any religion at all, they begin with a compact between the divine, the natural world, and mankind, and then that falls apart. So that is in fact how the Bible begins, is it not? So our cult is trying to put these things back together.
The novel's filled with your trademark lyricism, and that same lyricism comes through whatever you're doing, whether you're writing children's books, a libretto, a blog. And I just wonder if you consider yourself first and foremost a poet.
That's a very difficult question.
I knew it would be.
I think poetry is very central to our engagement with language. If you look at what little kids do before the age of 5, they learn language, they sing, they dance, they make up poetry, and they tell stories and understand them. And that is, I think, our essential human toolkit.
I wonder if I could prevail upon you to read one of your poems. The Poet Has Come Back from your collection, The Door.
Yes, and what is it about? Is a nice person the same as a good writer? No. Unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
The poet has come back to being a poet after decades of being virtuous instead. Can't you be both? No, not in public. You could once, back when God was still thundering vengeance and liked the scent of blood and hadn't got around to slippery forgiveness. Then you could scatter incense and praise and wear your snake necklace and hymn the crushed skulls of your enemies to a pious chorus. No deferential smiling, no baking of cookies, no, I'm a nice person, really. Welcome back, my dear. Time to resume our vigil. Time to unlock the cellar door. Time to remind ourselves that the God of poets has 2 hands, the dexterous, the sinister.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much for being here, Margaret
Well,
Atwood.
it was a pleasure.
And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.